In May of last year, I was driving the lonely Highway 287 north of Rexburg, Idaho. I had just crossed over into Montana. The big skies enveloped me and I had my eyes on the road, but it was stormy. That Saturday afternoon drew on and the sun was beginning to set low in the hills. Visibility became almost non-existent. I slowed a bit and I remember thinking that, though I was alone, that peaceful stretch of road was just what I needed at the time. Sometimes thunderstorms are what we need to be reminded that we are all in this boat of life together, and the storms sometimes affect us all, as do the sunny days. It left me there driving with my thoughts. As I tracked northward, just south of the town of Norris, I came upon a guardrail with a beautiful robin perched on top of it. I slowed down a bit on the off chance the bird would try to take off, and I didn't want it to make contact with my windshield. As I passed by, the bird, likely startled, took off to the west and impacted with my right fender. It was a loud noise. I knew the bird was likely not okay, but I hoped I was wrong. I turned on my hazards and I pulled off to the side of the road, walking back the 50 yards to where the bird lay, lifeless. I reached down and picked her up, hoping that she was okay. She was dead. I never like to see any creature suffer, and I most certainly was saddened to be partially responsible for the death of this one. I decided to place the bird on the other side of the guardrail and cover her with some sticks. I created a peaceful burial spot for that innocent robin. Drivers were honking at me as they went by, their visibility also low, and they wondered why I would have stopped in such a remote place. I waved them on, and I was left there to think. I thought about God's innocent creatures and how lucky we are that we are able to witness their beauty and that God allows us, even for a short time, to be in their presence. And I was reminded of this quote by the great Atticus Finch in To Kill a Mockingbird.
But remember, it was a sin to kill a mockingbird.
Why?
Well, I reckon because mockingbirds don't do anything but make music for us to enjoy. Don't need people's gardens. Don't nest in the corn cribs. They don't do one thing but just sing their hearts out for us.
This wasn't just any road trip. The day before, I had opened my email and I found that I had a ticket to attend the trial of the state of Idaho versus Lori Vallow Daybell in the very upper courtroom at the Ada County Courthouse in Boise on the morning of Monday, May 8th. The state reserved around 10 to 15 tickets each day of that trial for those who wanted to witness the proceedings in person. I'll go more into the story of Lori Vallow and Chad Daybell in a future episode, or even episodes plural of Saints and Sinners, but for the time being, suffice to say that Lori was found guilty of several charges at her Idaho trial in May of last year. Not the least of which were the murders of her two children, 16-year-old Tylee Ryan and 7-year-old Joshua J.J. Vallow, as well as the conspiracy to commit murder in the death of Tammy Daybell, the first wife of Lori's husband, Chad. It is a simultaneously horrific and interesting case, full of layers that just keep unraveling as the days and years go by. It's the story that keeps on giving for true crime enthusiasts and those who crave justice. There was a common theme to my trip to Idaho last May. Tylee and JJ had been taken from this earth far too soon, and in such a horrific manner, their innocent lives being cut short. I knew I wanted to look Lori in the face and to be there in person at this trial of trials in hopes that justice would indeed be found for Tylee, JJ, and Tammy, and that it will eventually be found for Charles Vallow, Lori's first husband, whose death she played a part in July of 2019 as well, and for which she will stand trial in Arizona when the time comes. The theme of innocence kept running through my mind as I drove and drove northward. After I prepared the final resting place of that kind robin, I continued northward to western Montana, past the town of Butte, and through Missoula, a beautiful place known for many things, not the least of which was the 1992 film A River Runs Through It, directed by Robert Redford, and starring a young Brad Pitt, as well as Craig Schaefer and Tom Skerritt. A young Joseph Gordon-Levitt even plays the film's protagonist Norman McLean when he was a young boy. The film was autobiographical, written by the real-life Norman about his childhood in Montana with his family and his growth into adulthood and the loss of innocence that often comes with growing older. I stayed the night of May 6th to the 7th at the Stardust Motel in the small town of Wallace, Idaho. In November of 2022, another crime story would rock northern Idaho. So my road trip was about that too. In the morning and early afternoon of Sunday, November 13th, 2022, the bodies of 4 college students at the University of Idaho in Moscow, just an hour and a half south of Coeur d'Alene and 5.5 hours north of Boise, were found on various floors of the house at 1122 King Road. The house was gray in color, dawned in siding and 3 stories high, adjacent to the University of Idaho campus, and the bodies of Maddie Mogan, Kaylee Goncalves, Ethan Chapin, and Ethan's girlfriend Xana Kernodle were found brutally stabbed to death in their beds. That Sunday morning in Moscow was a quiet one, the day after a home football game that would pit the University of Idaho Vandals against the Aggies of UC Davis at the Kibbe Dome on campus, just over a mile away from 1122 King Road, and the 4 had all watched the game together, along with 2 other roommates, Dylan Mortensen and Bethany Funk. In one final tragic Instagram post, Kaylee Goncalves posted about this moment with her friends, and she shared photos of the group together for one last moment, and she captioned it, "One lucky girl to be surrounded by these people every day." Evil takes the innocent in this episode of Saints and Sinners, True Crime and the History of the West, 1122 King Road. On a flight back from Paris, I crossed the Atlantic on the night of Saturday, November 12th, 2022. It was a direct flight from Paris to Salt Lake City, and it would take 11 hours. I sat next to a wonderful woman, a performance artist who lives in LA, and we had a great conversation. She spends a lot of time in Paris teaching classes on the performance arts and is an actress herself. I relayed to her some of the fantastic days I had spent traversing the European continent with a wonderful person. In the week preceding, I had spent some magical days in Paris and then on to Italy, where I visited the cities of Bologna, Florence, and Rome. On Friday, November 4th, on the hill at Montmartre, near the Cathedral of Sacré-Cœur, I was reunited with Julia, an Italian woman I had met at the Père Lachaise Cemetery in Paris the previous June. We had originally met, in fact, at the very grave of Jim Morrison, the lead singer of The Doors, who had passed away at the age of 27 on July 3rd, 1971 from heart failure, most likely due to years of drug and alcohol abuse. We kept in touch, Julia and I, all those many months from June to November, and I resolved to return to Europe to see her once again and visit her hometown. After a couple of wonderful days in Paris, going up in the Eiffel Tower at night, exploring the Père Lachaise Cemetery, having sushi near the Moulin Rouge, walking the gardens of Versailles, and witnessing the light shining through the stained glass windows of the beautiful Sainte-Chapelle, we boarded a plane for Italy, my first time there, in fact, and we touched down in Bologna. I was in awe as we walked the streets of Julia's hometown and made our way through the porticos of that beautiful city. During the days that would follow, we stayed in several places, one of which was a home built in 1421 in the hills of Grizzana Morandi, outside Bologna. We also passed through Florence, where we saw Michelangelo's David, the Ponte Vecchio, and visited the graves of Michelangelo, Galileo, and many others who had only read about in books. Then it was on to Rome, with a stroll through the Colosseum and Forum, tossing coins into the Trevi Fountain, and witnessing the ancient doors of the Pantheon under the moonlight. As I spent this wonderful week in Europe with Julia, one of the best weeks of my life, 4 college students in Moscow, Idaho were living their best lives during what would be the last week they would spend on this earth. The murders would happen in the middle of the night between November 12th and November 13th, 2022. During the very time I was in the air over the Atlantic returning from Europe. As I touched down in Salt Lake City early in the afternoon of Sunday, November 13th, my mom, who had picked me up from the airport, had the news playing on the radio of her Ford Explorer. These words would come across during the broadcast. 4 students at the University of Idaho were found murdered today in a possible robbery gone wrong. The suspect or suspects in the crime are still at large. My mom took me to get a bite to eat, and I returned home, greeted my cat, and turned on the TV to see if any other information was given about the murders. The information about the crime and the days and weeks that would follow came very slowly. Moscow Police Chief James Fry would make many TV appearances, but it seemed that less and less was being said about the case each time he appeared.
6 weeks later, the murder investigation of 4 University of Idaho college students seemingly stuck in neutral. No publicly known suspects or motive, and every week, questions outweigh answers.
This is a complex case.
Despite the public's impression, Moscow Police Chief James Fry says there is, in fact, movement in the case. He just can't talk about it.
Is there anything new in the investigation?
What I can tell you is this case is not going cold. We're still receiving hundreds of tips daily. We are following up on those tips. We're still building that picture.
Police say one of those pieces is a white Hyundai Elantra in the area at the time of the murders. Investigators asked the public for help, who responded with thousands of tips. But hopes were dashed yesterday when police looked at a car matching the description and found it was unrelated. Another thread unraveled, the public desperate for any information.
I know that's very frustrating. It's frustrating to family members and the community, but our end goal is to bring somebody to justice.
That frustration in part leading to a surge of internet sleuths, online communities trying to crack the case themselves. Police say it's led to misinformation they've had to spend resources dispelling.
How much does that interfere with your investigation?
I think rumors always hurt us in an investigation, but it's our job to go back and utilize our resources and to continue to vet those.
But 10,000 tips later, no arrest. Only hope from a community haunted by a killer still on the loose, and a pledge from their police chief.
We are committed to this case. We are committed to solving this case.
Steve Patterson, NBC News.
During the majority of the weeks that followed the murders, small and often frustrating pieces of information would be released bit by bit, little by little. It was found that there were 6 students who were sleeping at 1122 King Road the night of the crime. 4 of the students, Kaylee, Maddie, Xana, and Ethan, would be found brutally stabbed on or near their beds late that Sunday morning in November. But the baffling part was there were 2 others who slept in the house that night who were unharmed, Dylan Mortensen and Bethany Funk. This fueled a firestorm of speculation as to whether the 2 surviving girls were somehow involved in the murders, or whether they had possibly hired someone to kill their roommates while they slept soundly. Many possible explanations for the murders were given, both in the news and by amateur sleuths, who said that maybe it was due to a drug deal gone wrong or some sort of gang retribution surfacing from someone in the group that had wronged somebody at some point during their lives. Some of the first bits of information that were released and verified were that the murders had been committed by what was likely a fixed-blade knife, possibly military in nature, and likely a K-bar, which is standard issue and has been for many years in the Marine Corps and American military. Eventually, it would be said that a white Hyundai Elantra, possibly a 2014 or 2015, was seen in the area during the time of the crimes, and that the police were looking for anyone who had any information about this vehicle. Behind the scenes, the local Moscow police and the FBI were piecing things together little by little. By the end of November, the likely time of the night or early morning that the murders had taken place hadn't even been released. Like a horror film that waits and waits to show you who the villain really is, this sparked interest and fascination in the case worldwide. As police and news agencies around Moscow continued their interviews with those who knew the 4 murdered students the best, they were able to narrow things down a bit. A lot of things were going on behind closed doors during the investigation that wouldn't be released until later on. It appeared that during the late afternoon of Saturday, November 12th, the group of friends gathered to watch the football game that had taken place on campus that day. Some photos were released from Kaylee's Instagram account with the group donned in gold and black, the team colors of the University of Idaho Vandals. Those photos would flash on the news and online over and over, and it fueled the fascination. The 4 killed were attractive, each and every one of them, and you could see the hope and optimism for their lives in their eyes as they gathered together one last time. On the night of the 12th, Ethan Chapin, a tall, handsome, brown-haired male of 20, a triplet in fact, whose 2 siblings were also attending the university, attended a formal with his sister. Then he went to the Sigma Chi fraternity house with his girlfriend Xana Kernodle, also 20 years old. Kaylee Goncalves and Maddie Mogan, best friends for the majority of their short lives, were 21 years of age. Kaylee had recently finished school and was going to graduate early in December before officially moving to Austin, Texas, where she was going to work at a marketing job that she was greatly looking forward to. She was excited to spread her wings, and she had, in fact, already moved out of her room on the 3rd floor of the house at King Road. She'd return that weekend to spend time with her friends and show them the 2016 Range Rover SUV that she recently purchased. The two girls spent much of the night at the Corner Club, a small bar at 202 Main Street in Moscow, a common haunt for Idaho Vandal students, and even those across the border of Washington in Pullman, just a few miles down the road at Washington State. They'd often come to party at the Corner Club as well. Surveillance videos were released of Maddie and Kaylee showing their IDs at the Corner Club at around 10:30 p.m., and they would stay there for nearly 3 hours. After leaving the Corner Club on foot and stumbling and wearing baggy and comfortable clothes, another surveillance camera would pick them up walking the streets of Moscow with an unknown male headed in the direction of the grub truck, which would normally park on Main Street between 1st and 6th South near the Garden Lounge and was a common place for students to gather on game nights to order their tasty mac and cheese. Yet another surveillance video would be released showing Maddie and Kaylee ordering at their grub truck. An ominous male would be standing in the background wearing a hoodie and would be known by online sleuths of the case simply as Hoodie Guy. He stood about 10 feet behind the two girls and appeared to be staring them down, not really ever conversing with them. This made him a possible suspect of the murders in the public's eye. Moments later, the two girls, now with their mac and cheese, would leave the frame of the surveillance camera, and you'd see Hoodie Guy appear to raise his arm in frustration, walking the opposite direction of Maddie and Kaylee. It was later released that the two were headed to get into a ride share that would take them home. They were both highly intoxicated by hours of alcohol use by this point. By all accounts, Maddie and Kaylee arrived back at 1122 King Road just before 2 a.m., just about 15 minutes after they had ordered their food at the grub truck. The rideshare driver would also become a possible suspect in the murders, in the view of the public at least. In the weeks after November 13th, there was some excellent news reporting in the case. I personally followed closely the stories of Brian Enton, a senior national correspondent with News Nation. He was dogged and sympathetic in his approach to the reporting, and he would often do spots on nightly News Nation programs hosted by Ashley Banfield and others. I wanted to meet him at the trial of Lori Vallow that I attended in May, but wasn't lucky enough to cross paths with him. Daily, he would report on possible routes that the killer or killers could have taken to 1122 King Road that night to commit the crime, and he would conduct interviews with the families of the victims. The family of Kaylee Goncalves, and namely her father Steve, were often very outspoken regarding the police's handling of the case, and would regularly express this in interviews with Enton. Here they discussed with News Nation some of the possible suspects in the case, many of them close to Kaylee and Maddie, one of which was even Kaylee's ex-boyfriend Jack, who many suspected to be involved.
News Nation's Bryan Enton joining us live now from Moscow. And Bryan, some of these family members are frustrated. Are we any closer to a suspect than we were 3 weeks ago?
Unfortunately, not that we know of, Natasha. The latest we have heard from police is that there is still no known suspect and not even any persons of interest. The prosecutor told me this week they don't have any video of a suspect on camera, and they're still soliciting tips from the public now 3 weeks after the murders in the house behind me. You can see this is still a crime scene tape. The police department here has hired private security to keep an eye on the house at all times as the victims' families grow frustrated. I spoke with Kaylee Goncalves' family, her mom and dad and sister, who say they're just growing impatient and they want more information from the police. Is anyone acting differently since the murders? I mean, is there anyone that you have a weird feeling about that the girls knew or that comes to mind?
Yeah, I would say not in the immediate circle by any means, but a few of the names that have been circulating around, I think it's hard not to kind of, dig into this. And I don't know how much of that is just because we have so little information from law enforcement and how much of it really is, a sister or a father's intuition.
Can you elaborate at all? I don't know. You don't have to give a name, but I mean, is it someone that she knew or?
I have something to say about that. I just feel like there's been a couple individuals that were cleared very fast. That may not. Maybe he shouldn't have been. And yeah.
She had the strong alibi.
Just really fast.
If you can dismiss
an hour later, and we're like, what? And I don't know. I don't know anything about those individuals. I just know they were people that definitely should have been looked at, and yeah.
I don't know what would prevent you from sharing somebody's alibi.
Yeah, I think that's what we're struggling with. So it's like, we know what we know. We've, fought for Jack, Kaylee's boyfriend, and, we still stand that way. So I did just kind of want to clear that up while we're talking through this ambiguity that, that's not what we're honing in on here.
We don't want to make more victims out of innocent people.
Exactly.
We definitely don't want to do that.
Another early piece of information released to the public was that Jack DeCoeur, the former boyfriend of Kaylee Goncalves, received several calls from Kaylee around 2:30 a.m. on the night of the murders. He was sleeping and was unable to answer, but many were left to wonder, why had she called him so many times that night? Was she fearful that someone was in the house that shouldn't be? Did she need help? Or was she simply excited and intoxicated from the events of the day? With only bits and pieces of information released to the public for literally the first 6 weeks after the murders, it left you to wonder, in which order were the victims killed? Did anyone try to fight back? Were there multiple killers, some to hold the victims down while the others inflicted the wounds with the K-bar knife? Someone to keep a lookout? There had to be more than one killer, right? Otherwise, how could one lone murderer dispatch of not one, not two, not three, but 4 people in just a matter of minutes with nothing more than a knife? And why were the other 2 roommates left alive? It came out that Ethan and Xana were sleeping in Xana's room that night on the 2nd floor, and Maddie and Kaylee were on the 3rd floor. At first, it was thought that Maddie and Kaylee were sleeping in separate bedrooms, but it was later found that the 2 had been discovered murdered in the same bed, in Maddie's room on the 3rd floor. Oh, and there was a dog in the house that night, Kaylee's golden doodle named Murphy, and the dog survived as well, unharmed. Why had neighbors not heard the dog bark? He most certainly was traumatized by what was going on, right? A lot of these details just didn't make any sense. The facts being released were more bizarre than any movie script and made the Scream films seem like child's play. Also, where was this white Hyundai Elantra that the police were looking for? In late November, a vigil was held at the Kibbe Dome, and many family members of the victims spoke. The words of Stacy Chapin rang loudly.
I'd like to start by saying my name is Stacy Chapin. I'm Ethan's mom. I'm here tonight with my husband, Jim, Ethan's dad, and his brother, Hunter, and his sister Maisie, who are also vandals. I think you knew he was a triplet, and they all go here as well. Okay. We want to start by extending our deepest condolences to all the families impacted by this tragedy. We are eternally grateful that we spent so much time with him. And I want to remind you that that's the most important message that we have for you and your families, is to make sure that you spend as much time as possible with those people, because time is precious and it's something you can't get back.
Entering December, still no answers. Many were glued to their televisions and YouTube trying to piece the story together. A group of students were arrested for underage drinking in the middle of the night at Band Field on campus, at almost exactly the same time that many thought the murders had occurred on King Road. Band Field is literally just down off the hill from the murder house, a mere 75 yards away, and on the other side of Band Field is the Sigma Chi fraternity house, where Xana and Ethan had spent the earlier part of the night. The campus and adjacent hillside is crowded with apartment buildings and off-campus housing. With such close proximity, how had no one heard anything? Or seen anything, for that matter? The answers, a motive, a possible culprit or culprits, still nothing. Then came Friday, December 30th, 2022, 6 weeks after the murders, and we saw a face flash on our television screens of a young man with a stone-cold stare, a large nose, and bushy eyebrows. The police had taken 28-year-old Bryan Kohberger into custody in the middle of the night at his parents' home near Albrightsville, Pennsylvania, 2,500 miles from Moscow, Idaho. I heard the news while driving to California with my brother to watch the University of Utah Utes take on the Penn State Nittany Lions in the Rose Bowl. I couldn't believe it. Someone was in custody. Did he have any help? Moscow Police Chief James Fry gave another press conference.
Thank you for coming today. Last night, in conjunction with the Pennsylvania State Police, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, detectives arrested 28-year-old Bryan Christopher Kohberger in Albrightsville, Pennsylvania, on a warrant for murders of Ethan, Xana, Madison, and Kaylee. I want to personally thank these agencies for their assistance in this case. Kohberger resides in Pullman, Washington, and is a graduate student at Washington State University. We will provide as much information as we can about the extradition to Idaho and the criminal process. However, due to Idaho state law, we are limited in what information we can release today until Kohberger has his initial appearance in Idaho court. I want to express my appreciation to our local community, the people of Idaho, and those throughout our nation who provided information to help us investigate these murders has been very impressive. We've received over 19,000 tips, and we've conducted over 300 interviews.
Kohberger would be extradited to Idaho in early January, and on January 5th, 2023, the probable cause affidavit in the case was released. So many answers came to life in that one document. Brett Payne was a rookie with the Moscow Police Department, and he compiled the document. It was incredibly detailed. On Sunday, November 13th, 2022, at approximately 4 p.m., Moscow PD Sergeant Blaker, as well as Officer Payne, responded to 1122 King Road to process the crime scene. The two entered through the bottom floor door on the north side of the house. That had been the floor where Bethany Funk, one of the two surviving roommates, had slept that night. The two officers then walked upstairs to the second floor, where they were directed down the hallway to the west bedroom. It was later learned by the officers that this was Xana Kernodle's room, and her boyfriend Ethan had spent the night. As the officers approached the room, they could see, off to the side, the body of 20-year-old Xana, laying on the floor in a pool of blood against the south wall. During some of the reporting that had been done in the days and weeks that would follow, it was found that blood was actually dripping down the outside of the foundation of the south wall of Xana's room, and strips of blood could literally be seen from outside the house. It had soaked through the floor and wall and made its way down to the outer foundation of the second floor. Xana had been killed with what appeared to be a large, edged weapon, and several of her fingers had been nearly severed in what appeared to be defensive wounds, possibly trying to stop the attacker from making contact with her vital organs. Also in the room was a male, identified as Ethan Chapin, Xana's boyfriend, who also had several significant sharp force injuries. From all accounts to date, it appears that neither of their faces were injured, and the attacker was likely aiming for vital organs in the lower to mid-torso. The two officers then went back into the hall, down a couple of steps to the right, past the kitchen, and up the stairs to the third floor. The third floor consisted of two bedrooms, one on the west side, which was Kaylee's room, and it consisted of a sliding glass door that went out to a long balcony on the south side of the third floor. Murphy, Kaylee's dog, was found in that room, unharmed. The officers later found out that the dog belonged to Kaylee and her ex-boyfriend, Jack DeCore. On the east side of the third floor, there was a small bathroom that shared a wall with a small bedroom situated at the southeast corner of the third floor. That was Maddie's room. As the officers entered Maddie's room, they could see two females, later found to be Maddie Mogan and Kaylee Goncalves, laying on the bed with visible stab wounds. From all accounts and information to date, Maddie was laying face down on the right side of the bed, while Kaylee was sitting face up on the left side of the bed, leaning against the wall. Kaylee appeared to have had deeper wounds than Maddie. A tan leather knife sheath was found laying on the bed next to Maddie's right side and slightly under her body, but barely visible. The sheath was taken into custody and processed, and the words K-Bar USMC were imprinted on it with the United States Marine Corps Eagle Globe and anchor signia stamped on the outside of it as well. The knife sheath, not only literally part of the likely murder weapon, was also found to have had a single source of male DNA left on it on the button snap. Several interviews were conducted by the police, and the two surviving roommates, Dylan Mortensen and Bethany Funk, were in the house at the time of the murders, and thought up until that point to likely have been asleep during the killings. As it turns out, at least one of them was likely awake during the murders. Bethany's room, as I stated before, was on the east side of the first floor of the residence, and Dylan's room was on the east side of the second floor. For someone to walk up the stairs to the third floor from the second floor, they would have had to walk right past Dylan's bedroom. It would also later come out that the police hadn't been called until 11:56 a.m. that morning. If you do the math, that is nearly 8 hours after the murders. Up until this point, we've gone over the possible timeline of that night and where everyone was leading up to returning home, but the affidavit cleared it up even more. On the evening of November 12th, 2022, Xana and Ethan were seen by Bethany Funk at the Sigma Chi house on the Idaho campus at approximately 9 p.m. and were thought to have returned home around 1:45 a.m. Dylan and Bethany were already home at this time. The two young women had gotten home around 1 a.m. Bethany also stated to police that Ethan did not live at the King Road house, but was Xana's guest that night. As I stated before, Kaylee and Maddie were at the Corner Club that night and were seen near the grub truck in town ordering food a little after 1:30 a.m. A third party later reported that he provided a ride to Maddie and Kaylee and dropped them off at 1122 King Road at approximately 1:56 a.m. Dylan and Bethany made clear to the police that all the occupants of the house were home by 2 a.m. and asleep, or at least in their beds, by 4 a.m. Dylan stated that she went to sleep likely between 1 a.m. and 2 a.m. in her bedroom on the southeast side of the second floor, but she woke up at approximately 4 a.m. by what she stated sounded like Kaylee upstairs on the third floor playing with her dog. A short time later, Dylan heard who she thought was Kaylee say something to the effect of, "There's someone here." The police later found that it was possibly Xana who said that, as her phone showed that she was likely awake and using the TikTok app at approximately 4:12 a.m. When Dylan woke up and heard these sounds, she looked out of her bedroom and didn't see anything. She closed her bedroom door and backed away from it. Then, a moment later, Dylan heard what she thought was crying coming from Xana's bedroom on the second floor, and she heard what she thought was a male voice saying something like, "It's okay, I'm going to help you." At approximately 4:17 a.m., a security camera at 1112 King Road, a residence immediately to the northwest of 1122 King Road, picked up distorted audio of what sounded like voices or a whimper followed by a loud thud. A dog could also be heard barking numerous times starting at 4:17 a.m. That security camera is less than 50 feet from the west wall of Xana's bedroom. Remember the blood found dripping down the outside of the foundation? The thud picked up by the security camera could quite possibly have been either Xana or Ethan falling to the floor. Dylan said she opened her door a third time after hearing someone cry, and she saw a figure clad in black clothing, wearing a mask that covered their mouth and nose, walking towards her. She said the figure appeared to be a 5'10" or taller male, not very muscular but athletically built with bushy eyebrows. The male in the mask walked past Dylan as she stood in a frozen shock phase. Her words. He entered the kitchen on the second floor and quickly walked out of the sliding glass door, exiting the house. All of this evidence, as well as forensic downloads of the phones of the residents, led law enforcement to narrow the timeline of the murders to between 4 a.m. and 4:25 a.m. During the processing of the crime scene, investigators found a latent shoe print, likely from a Vans-type shoe just outside of Dylan's bedroom door on the second floor. This is consistent with where Dylan stated that the likely killer had walked by her that night. A canvassing of the area revealed that there were several surveillance cameras that were active that night from both residences and businesses. A review of camera footage indicated that a white sedan was observed traveling westbound in the 700 block of Indian Hills Drive in Moscow at around 3:26 a.m. and then westbound on Steiner Avenue at 3:28 a.m. These videos showed that the vehicle was not displaying a front license plate. A review of the footage from the King Road neighborhood showed multiple sightings of this white Hyundai Elantra, starting at 3:29 a.m. and ending at 4:20 a.m. These sightings showed the white Hyundai Elantra making 3 initial passes by the 1122 King Road residence and then ultimately leaving on Walenta Drive. Even on the night after a game day, at 4 a.m., Moscow is nearly a ghost town on the roads, and moving vehicles are few and far between, making the white Hyundai Elantra of the suspect stick out like a sore thumb. The vehicle was even seen entering the area a fourth time at approximately 4:04 a.m. and driving eastbound on King Road, stopping and turning around nearly directly in front of the location of the murders before looping around an apartment building and leaving view. Then, just after 4:20 a.m. at a high rate of speed, the Elantra was picked up again departing the area of the King Road residence, turning up Willenta Drive, likely leaving town as it was not picked up on camera again. It was later found based on phone pings that the white Hyundai Elantra likely took a circuitous route as it left Moscow, and it headed out of Moscow to the south. Investigators also were given access to video footage from Washington State University in Pullman, just 9 miles to the west of Moscow, and at approximately 2:53 a.m., a white Hyundai Elantra was observed traveling east toward SR 270, which leads to Moscow. Jump forward a couple of hours. At approximately 5:25 a.m., a white Hyundai Elantra was again observed by 5 cameras in Pullman. Based on all of this information, on November 25, 2022, the Moscow Police Department asked law enforcement agencies to be on the lookout for a white Hyundai Elantra. On November 29, 2022, at approximately 12:30 p.m., Washington State University officer Daniel Tiengo looked up a white Hyundai Elantra registered at Washington State. He located a 2015 Elantra with a Pennsylvania plate registered to a Bryan Kohberger, residing at 1630 Northeast Valley Road, apartment 201 in Pullman. At around 1 p.m. on November 29th, the officer drove by the apartment building at that location and saw a white 2015 Hyundai Elantra in the parking lot. The officer ran the vehicle information through the system and verified based on Kohberger's driver's license that he is indeed 6 feet tall and weighs 185 pounds, only 2 inches taller than Dylan's description. Bryan does indeed have bushy eyebrows. It was found that on August 21st, 2022, Bryan Kohberger had been pulled over in Moscow for not wearing his seatbelt, and at that time the vehicle had a Pennsylvania plate. He was also pulled over on October 22nd, 2022 in Pullman for not making a proper stop at an intersection. Here's some audio from that stop.
Hello, I am Officer Loangus. Stops being audio and video recorded. I think you know why I stopped you. You ran the red light.
What actually happened was I was stuck in the middle of the intersection.
Yeah,
so
I was behind you the whole time. Yeah.
Yeah.
So technically you're not supposed to enter the intersection at all for that reason, because if the light turns red, then you're stuck in the intersection, and then you run the red light. So that's the reason I stopped you. Do you have your license on you?
Yep.
Do you have the registration and insurance?
So would you explain that to me a little bit further? So in Pennsylvania, when you're stuck like in the intersection, you have to make the left. So what would the appropriate thing for me to have done? Just
you're not supposed to block an intersection like that in Washington, so just by you blocking the intersection, that's technically a ticketable violation, and then you're running a red light, so it's another ticketable offense. So you're not supposed to proceed into the intersection until you can go, because a lot of people do what you just did, right? Is like you're sitting in the intersection waiting, and then turns, and then you're blocking, so.
Yeah, there was a little bit of confusion with speeding because someone had stopped. I wasn't sure what they were doing, and then they put on their light to turn. So I thought that maybe they were letting me go through.
Oh.
Did you see that?
No.
I feel like right before I made the turn, there was someone who made a right. They didn't have their signal on, so I wasn't sure if they were just waiting.
Yeah, so I would just advise just don't enter the intersection until you can go, so you don't get stuck.
On November 18th, just 5 days after the murders, Kohberger registered the 2015 white Hyundai Elantra and obtained Washington plates. Prior to this time, the vehicle was registered in Pennsylvania, which does not require front license plates. Remember, the Elantra picked up on security cameras the night of the murders did not have a front plate. On December 13th, a license plate reader in Lorna, Colorado picked up Kohberger's plates, and on December 15th, Kohberger was pulled over in Indiana twice within 10 minutes for following too closely. He had his father with him in the vehicle, and apparently they were making a cross-country road trip from Pullman, Washington, back to the family home in Pennsylvania. As part of the investigation, It was found that Bryan Kohberger's phone did not ping in the immediate vicinity of the King Road residence between 3 a.m. and 5 a.m. on the night of the murders, but then pinged again back in Pullman shortly after 5 a.m. Police were able to pull genealogical DNA from the button snap of the knife sheath found under Maddie's body. They found that it matched almost exactly with that of someone who was a close, immediate relative of Bryan Kohberger, or with Kohberger himself. Then they surveilled the Kohberger home in Pennsylvania and witnessed Bryan Kohberger put garbage into his neighbor's trash can in the middle of the night. They tested the garbage for DNA and found that it was an exact match to the DNA on the button snap of the knife sheath. The police searched phone records further and found that Bryan likely took a circuitous route back to Pullman from Moscow the night of the murders, heading south, then southwest, and then back northwest to Pullman. It is suspected that at this point he likely dumped the murder weapon and the clothing that he had been wearing. Bryan's phone also pinged back in the Moscow area on the morning of November 13th at approximately 9 a.m. It is thought that at this time, he was either possibly returning to the King Road residence to try to retrieve the knife sheath that he had left, or simply to admire his handiwork. He had to have been baffled that there were no police on the scene yet. As I mentioned, authorities weren't even called until 11:56 a.m., almost 8 hours after the murders. Surveillance footage also picked up the same white Hyundai Elantra in the parking lot of an Albertsons supermarket in Clarkston, Washington at around 12:49 that afternoon, and saw none other than Bryan Kohberger exiting the vehicle. With a mountain of evidence against him and several hearings having taken place to date, Bryan Kohberger now sits in a jail cell at 522 South Adams Street in Moscow at the Latah County Jail, awaiting a trial that is likely a year or two or maybe even longer away. Back in May, on my trip to Idaho, I traveled to Moscow, and I walked up to the famous water tower on campus, looking at the hill where sat the house at 1122 King Road. I walked by Sigma Chi and Band Field on a peaceful Sunday morning in May, and I imagined it being a morning much like November 13th, 2022, just 6 months before, when the bodies of Maddie, Kaylee, Ethan, and Xana were found. I drove past Bryan's apartment in Pullman and made my way back to Moscow, driving past the Kibbe Dome, and I parked and walked up to the house at 1122 King Road, the scene of the crime, just a few short steps from Banfield, and I walked around the back of the house where the suspect Bryan Kohberger likely parked his Hyundai Elantra that night for fewer than 15 minutes, taking 4 lives and ruining many others. A motive still has not been released, but my theory on the crime is this. It was found in the investigations the police had conducted that Bryan's phone had pinged near 1122 King Road at least 12 different times between June and November of 2022. Some of those times it was even so close to the house that it was picked up by the house's Wi-Fi router. Bryan knew that house and its residents well, but they likely didn't know him at all. Bryan had, in my opinion, likely been by that house enough that he knew the layout, and possibly even who was living in each of the rooms. If he developed a crush on Maddie or Kaylee, possibly by social media, that could have drawn him to the house. And if he had been by the house enough, he would know that Kaylee had already moved out, and he likely wouldn't recognize the new Range Rover parked in the driveway. I believe the intended target that night was Maddie. Based on surveillance footage, Kohberger likely parked the white Hyundai Elantra right behind the house, with a clear view of Maddie's bedroom. I believe he was going to enter the house, kill Maddie after possibly having his way with her, and leave. Based on the sheath being left at the scene, it is likely that he didn't know Kaylee would be there that night, sharing a bed with her best friend. Most of Kaylee's things had already been moved out of the house as she was preparing for her job in Texas. He made his way from his vehicle, wearing a mask, covering most of his face, holding the K-bar knife, and pulling it out of the sheath as he entered the house and walked through the kitchen and up the stairs to the 3rd floor. He opened the door to Maddie's room and found Maddie and Kaylee there, and killed them both. It is highly possible, based on the sounds Dylan heard from downstairs, that Kaylee fought back, but ultimately succumbed to her injuries. Bryan then made his way back down to the 2nd floor and was, in my opinion, likely going to leave. However, Xana had been awake and on TikTok, so she had heard something coming from upstairs, and she had awakened Ethan. I believe Ethan came out into the hallway to investigate, and there Bryan attacked him, pushing him back into the bedroom and stabbing him to death. Then, Xana being a witness to all of this, Bryan attacked Xana, and she grabbed for the knife, trying to minimize her injuries, but ultimately passed away as well. Bryan then hurried back down the hall, past Dylan's room, where she saw him through a crack in the door, but he didn't see her, so her life was spared. And he promptly exited the sliding glass door in the kitchen, changed his clothing just outside the house, and jumped back into his vehicle. According to the information we have at this point, minimal, if any, blood was found in Bryan's car. He was likely very fastidious in the way he changed his clothing and kept the blood from getting on his car seats or in his trunk. And away he went, thinking he would get away with it. But noticing, once the adrenaline settled down as he was driving back down the road to leave Moscow, that he had left the knife sheath and it would be too risky to go back and get it. But what explains Dylan not contacting police until nearly noon the next day when Bryan had left the house at just after 4:20 a.m.? A better explanation for this likely will be given at trial, but I believe that Dylan was either likely still highly intoxicated from the day before or simply too frozen to move and didn't want to risk anyone hearing her make a sound, and she laid there frozen in fear for hours and hours. Bryan was studying at Washington State University to obtain a master's in criminology and had an undergrad degree from DeSales in Pennsylvania, where he had taken classes from Catherine Ramsland, who at one point had written a book about Dennis Rader, or BTK, an acronym for Bind, Torture, and Kill. The similarities between Rader and Kohberger are immense, not the least of which is that in January of 1974, Dennis Rader also entered a home uninvited and killed 4 people, the Otero family, in Wichita, leaving Payne in his wake. Those were also his first set of murders. This making the unproven assumption that Bryan hadn't killed before November 13th, 2022. In March of 2023, Idaho Governor Brad Little signed a new law giving the state's Department of Corrections up to 5 days after a death warrant is issued to determine if lethal injection drugs are available. If the drugs are not available, a firing squad can perform the execution. Then, in May of 2023, a grand jury indicted Kohberger in the case due to a substantial amount of evidence supporting and demonstrating his involvement in the murders. The trial date was originally set for October 2nd of last year, but has been postponed indefinitely at this point, and still Bryan Kohberger sits in a small jail cell below the Latah County Courthouse. On the morning of Thursday, December 28th, 2023, the house at 1122 King Road, where these 4 innocent students lost their lives, was demolished. This was a decision made by the University of Idaho, who had been gifted the house. They felt it necessary for the house to meet its demise, so the students who passed by it every day wouldn't have to be reminded of this horrific crime spree where 4 friends with so much promise lost their lives. The prosecution is banking on a conviction based on the quality of multiple 3D scans of the house and other methods of evidence collection. Last May, as I walked around the house, I was astonished that Xana's blood was still there, solidified on the foundation of the house, still visible from the outside. And it was a reminder that those affected by the horror of November 13th, 2022 will likely not be moving on anytime soon. In the words of the great Frodo Baggins in The Lord of the Rings, The Return of the King, how do you pick up the threads of an old life? How do you go on when in your heart you begin to understand there is no going back? There are some things that time cannot mend, some hurts that go too deep, that have taken hold. I'm Chad Mortensen. Join me next time for Saints and Sinners, True Crime in the History of the West.